Another important set of concepts in establishing what culture is, what defines culture, what creates culture, is values and norms. Values are moral beliefs. Norms are how values tell us to act. And socialization is the process by which a person internalizes the values, beliefs, and norms of society and learns to function as a member of that society. We begin learning values and norms at an early age, as you can imagine. Likely before you even are able to talk, you begin to figure out what the social cues in your society are and what the appropriate behaviors to those social cues are. This happens through the process of socialization. Our families socialize us, then our schools and teachers, of course, our friends, religion, the media, they all socialize us through the course of our lives. Probably, well, they all socialize us through the course of our lives, but the majority of the socialization is going to happen in the early years when you don't really know a whole lot. And as you get older, as they say, you become set in your ways. And once you become set in your ways, it's hard to change. There's a theory called reflection theory, and states that culture is a projection of social structures and relationships into the public sphere. A Marxist version of reflection theory argues that cultural objects reflect the material labor and production relationships that went into making them. This is the foundation of materialism. The media could be a great example for reflection theory. And of course, we'll talk more about this in a couple of minutes, but some reporters might say that they don't make the stories up, that they simply tell the stories that are already existing. Well, of course, reporters do sometimes pick and choose which stories to tell. So we can question whether the media reflects culture or creates culture, or both. As I mentioned, we'll talk more about this later. Science is the same way. We talk about unbiased scientific research and things like that, and that science is just studying what's out there. Well, it's studying what's out there based on what we want to study and how we want to study it. Culture plays a part in the scientific method. One of the things is to remove the impact of culture on how we determine what it is that we're researching. We want to remove emotion. We want to remove the cultural trappings that might encourage us to accept a certain finding over others. So a little earlier, we talked about we talked about the media, quote unquote, the media. What is the media? Well, the media is any format or vehicle that carries, presents, or communicates information. Simple as that. Books, posters, web pages, clay tablets, radios. Mass media refers to any form of media that reaches the mass of the people. One might argue the greatest technological innovation up into the computer was Gutenberg's printing press. There's no, it is apparent that the Protestant Reformation would not have happened, at least not in the way it did when Martin Luther goes and taxes 95 theses on the Catholic door. Well, those 95 theses were most likely reproduced with Gutenberg's printing press and then distributed far and wide. And it was the distribution of the 95 theses that changed everybody. If it would have just been Martin Luther tacking it on one Catholic church door, well, that probably wouldn't have went anywhere. But the addition of this new form of media, the ability to create something that can carry communication to a lot of people, was extremely important. And it laid the foundation for the Protestant Reformation and the loss of power by an extremely important and powerful institution at that time, the Catholic Church. We also, when we talk about the media, we have to talk about hegemony, which refers to the impact of media on culture and how people in society shape and are shaped by that dominant culture. Many critics of the media often argue that not all aspects of perspective are equally disseminated or valued in the media. Instead, only the dominant culture is reinforced through this media form. And granted, the media's power is not an example of domination, but it doesn't force anyone to do or believe anything. So it doesn't, it doesn't force anyone to believe anything. Rather, according to critics, the media gets people to go along with these ideas presented because it seems to portray the status quo or the natural order of things. Well, that natural order is not natural. It's being socially constructed by somebody. And the media is putting out a perspective, one, albeit the stated dominant perspective, but that's probably not the case, because those that control the media forms, those that can control the ability to disseminate this type of information to large groups of people, actually represent a small portion of our society. So even though it's called the dominant, that's just because that's the people in power, not necessarily the number of people in power. As I said, it's probably a minority, well, we know it's a minority of people that control these institutions and work in these institutions. So it's a minority creating a dominant perspective that's being fed to us through the media, and then we accept it as being real, as being natural. And we don't accept it, or we don't think deep about it. This is where the sociological imagination really comes into play, folks. You have to dig deeper than what they're feeding you. There's other things going on. I don't, it doesn't bother me if you watch the media. I watch it probably more than I should these days, because we have a very unorthodox president in office right now. But the media is feeding you a certain perspective. I highly encourage, I encourage all of you, if you want to see what's really going on today and why it's going on, there was a movie that came out in the early 1970s, won an Oscar, won many Oscars. It's called Network. And you watch Network and you think about what they're saying in Network in the early 1970s about how the networks were changing and how corporations were beginning to take over the media operations, and they were no longer allowed to be this unbiased portrayer of truth. Media all of a sudden had to make money. News all of a sudden had to make money. And when you put the money money-making criteria on a news organization, it's going to change the way news is presented. And as we're finding out, the truth might be sacrificed in that process. There's a thing that we call the media life cycle. Essentially what they're talking about is the textual analysis and audience studies, how people create media and the biases involved in that creation. how media reflect the culture in which they exist, and how individuals and groups use the media to change the culture. The media gives sociologists many avenues for research. So, and it must be researched because it's become such an important institution in the way that culture is transmitted to us. It's highly influential. The way that we're targeting children with media these days is atrocious, and we really need to be careful with how we use our media to shape what we think. The media effects can be placed into 4 different categories according to their education, or according to their duration and intention. There's the short-term and deliberate, the long-term and deliberate, the short-term and unintentional, and the long-term and unintentional. It's very difficult to determine causation between the media and behaviors, but we can see correlations and associations, and those can happen in different ways. As you see on this slide, some examples of these include the short-term and deliberate. Advertising, essentially buy our product the next time you go to the store, that type of stuff. A long-term and deliberate campaign, something more along the lines of anti-pollution, give a hoot, don't pollute, or take a bite out of crime. Those things are not necessarily designed to influence your short-term behavior. Those are trying to influence long-term behaviors. This is a long-term campaign to change behaviors within society. Unintentional violence in the media encourages violent behavior. Of course, the video and the video gamers and Hollywood would argue that that's not necessarily a causal relationship. And of course, long-term and unintentional prejudices, stereotypes, desensitization to violence, all of these things that we see people just don't care as much when the shooter in Las Vegas opened fire and killed somewhere in the 70s. We just kind of kept on going. That type of murder doesn't bother us as much anymore. We see it on a regular basis in our TV shows and our video games. See it on a regular basis. So you got to ask yourself, well, what are stereotypes and where do they come from? Intentionally or unintentionally, subtly or overtly, the media can create and reinforce ethnic, racial, gender, religious, and other types of stereotypes. Sometimes in the process, the media distracts people's attention from foundational issues or tensions that need to be addressed. The media is sometimes blamed for creating a false consciousness or allowing people to become distracted and disenfranchised, believing that social issues aren't that important or that there's nothing that they can do to help anyway. Reinforcing stereotypes. What are stereotypes? They're beliefs about entire groups that most likely shouldn't be used in reference to the entire group. Might be referent to an individual behavior, but not the entire group. Lazy Mexicans. Now, let's talk about that concept. Lazy Mexicans. I live in Fort Collins, Colorado, and I see Mexican laborers all over, or those of Mexican origin all over my town. And those folks are not lazy. They're up with the crack of dawn and they're working until the sun goes down and they get the job done fast. And so this idea of lazy Mexicans, all Mexicans are lazy. Not only is it not only is the stereotype effective, but it's incorrect.